Hello dear friends, I'm Edgar Allan Poe. Welcome to Historical Impact Private Lives, a channel where we recount historical events in a different way. For those who don't know me, and don't necessarily have to, during my time in these earthly valleys, I dedicated myself to being a poet, writer, critic, and journalist. I was born in Boston, United States, in 1809 and departed from this world on October 7, 1849. Life wasn't easy for me, but I believe I left something in my passage of human experience. Among other things, I was the first to write detective stories and establish that literary genre, which later many others used to continue. But I'll tell you my story another time. Today is not the purpose. The creators of this channel, Historical Impact, Private Lives, invited me to tell you 3 stories of almost perfect murders. The almost perfect part, you can already imagine why. Basically because their results were not what those who committed them expected. Before continuing, I ask if you have already subscribed to this channel, and if you haven't, I kindly ask you to do so. You won't regret it. As I was saying, today I will tell you 3 stories of murderers who couldn't carry out their purposes of having their crimes remain undiscovered. These stories have the particularity that they were events that occurred in distant times, at least for those of you watching now. But we will analyze together, in addition to the facts, their triggers, the motivations of the murderers, their profiles, their historical circumstances. For those who love detective genre or criminology, I tell you that to analyze this type of event, the first thing is to rid ourselves of prejudices. It is clear that decent people, like you, know perfectly well the moral value of something that is wrong. And what is wrong will always be wrong in any era of humanity. But here, we will try to get into the mind of the murderer, navigate through their intentions, and also have an entertaining time. Because although it is a subject that does not imply joy, it can be a topic that invites us to think and reflect. Don't be afraid. You know as well as I do that to think and reflect are not bad words. What do you think? I invite you to accompany me until the end. And don't forget to follow us on this channel, Historical Impact, Private Lives. I ask you, Edgar Allan Poe. The first story takes us to Belgium in the year 1880, where Armand Pelsantel lived, an engineer working in the city of Amberes. According to the chronicles of the time, this Mr. Pelsantel would have fallen hopelessly in love with a girl named Julie Vernet, who was said to be very beautiful, at least for Armand Pelsantel, but had a flaw. For Armand's interest, she was married to a lawyer, Mr. Guillermo Vernet. And here's the obvious. Armand Pelsantel decides to eliminate Guillermo Vernet, the husband of the woman he had fallen in love with, Julie Vernet. And here, dear friends, we come to the first consideration that every good consumer of crime genre, or even those who like criminology as a science, must have. And it's the value of doubt, which leads to a magnificent tool, which is the question. So I invite you to ask the first questions with the data we have about this case. Imagine you, ladies or gentlemen watching us, fall in love with the wife of a lawyer. The first problem you will encounter is not that this woman is married to a lawyer, or whatever profession the person living with the one you intend to love may have, but rather convincing this person to fall in love with you. Doesn't it seem so? Once that's achieved, perhaps there's no need to even attempt to eliminate the lawyer husband of the lady. The big problem here, as obvious as it may be and even absurd, is that if someone falls in love with a married woman who has intentions of eliminating her husband, if they haven't ensured that this woman loves them, their intention won't have much effect. In other words, because no matter which angle we analyze this intention from, based on the logical sequence, we'll come to the conclusion that trying to kill the husband of a woman you've fallen for is a futile endeavor, whether she loves you or not. The conclusion of this reasoning would lead us to the practical futility of the intention to kill someone for this reason. Because if the person is not in love, and not even interested in us, it's just as pointless as if they are. In either scenario, taking the trouble to kill a potential rival is utterly pointless, especially given the potential cost for someone trying to become a murderer. But let's continue with the story of Armand Pelsantel and his misguided murderous intentions. Killing the lawyer and then ending up in prison would serve him no purpose. As Armand had certain inclinations that we'll label as disturbing, just to avoid filling this narrative with adjectives, he began to think of various means to kill without being discovered. Armand Pelcent tells had a younger brother named Leon, who owed him a great debt. And here we won't go into the detail of whether the debt was of an economic nature or otherwise. What matters is that Leon owed him something important to his brother Armand. Armand got in touch with his brother Leon and arranged to meet him in Paris. During that meeting, Armand explained his plan to his brother and told him that if he helped with that plan, he would forgive the debt he owed him. Here, a consideration is introduced that is often present in these dynamics of murderers, but not only of murderers, but of those who take advantage of others for their own ends. That is manipulation and how to make the other person want to do something that compromises them, as is the case here. This also reveals the profile of Leon Pleasant Tells, the brother of the ideologue Armand, someone probably submerged under the shadow of his brother, with talents that were never recognized, and who now not only had the opportunity to prove them, but also to be recognized and forgiven. What an emotional and psychological burden for these brothers. Let's continue with the facts. When Leon decides to cooperate with Armand, and here he makes the biggest mistake of his life, only for personal gain. And Armand also makes his first strategic mistake as the ideologue of this conspiracy of evil, which is having an accomplice. Armand's plan was simple. The crime would be committed by a non-existent person. So they invented a person who didn't exist and then set out to cast suspicion on this person. How did they do it? Leon assumed the role of the non-existent man, changing his appearance, physical build, and attire to disguise himself as the character they created, named Henry Bogan. They added characteristics to this Bogan character, such as being a millionaire who was preparing to create a fleet of steamships of the time that would connect Amsterdam with Sydney. To achieve that character, Armand had to make a significant financial investment, not only to aesthetically shape the creation of the character by his brother Leon, clothing, hair, overall appearance, etc., but also to make this character behave like a millionaire. Here we must make another brief comment. We are not facing a crime motivated by a moment of madness. We are facing an act with great premeditation. After transforming into this Henry Bogan, Leon visited Amsterdam and Brussels, stayed in the most luxurious hotels, and became known to most of the important shipping companies of the time. In accordance with Armand's plans, Leon wrote a letter to the lawyer Guillermo Vernet, husband of the coveted Julie, signing as Henry Bogan, in which he explained that some English friends had recommended him as a lawyer to represent the new steamship line in Brussels. Guillermo Vernet accepted the interview with the invented Henry Bogan. Leon, portraying Henry, with a beard, glasses, and impeccable attire, received Vernet in his apartment, and it was then, at a certain moment, that he pulled a revolver from his clothes and fatally shot Guillermo Vernet. After the murder, Leon got rid of the beard, the wig he had for his hairstyle, and everything that linked him to the character of Henry Bogan. Therefore, the killer also vanished. He disappeared into thin air. But there were failures, the first and foremost being that the widow, Julie Vernet, as we had anticipated as a hypothesis, was not interested in Armand Pelcent in the slightest. Armand treated her socially, but she had never shown any sign of interest towards him. Armand went to visit her when the disappearance of Julie Vernet's lawyer husband became public, but she barely thanked him politely, saying she was too busy watering her garden flowers and thinking about her missing husband. So Armand didn't have a chance to make a move in the possibility that only he had imagined of being loved by Julie, who didn't even acknowledge him. And the second failure, the crime was eventually discovered. And how was the crime discovered? You may ask, and why? I will add. Primarily because there is no worse strategy for someone who intends to handle lies, concealment, and even murder than vanity. The vanity of believing oneself to be intelligent and falling into the imprudence that comes from overestimating one's own worth. And there arises Leon's fragile personality, who had gone to Switzerland and read the newspaper every day, searching for news about the discovery of Guillermo Vernet's body. 10 days passed, and the body was still not found. This led Leon Pleasant to become anxious. We know, anxiety is not a good counselor, especially for a murderer who has not yet been discovered. It was then that he wrote a letter to the Belgian police, directing them towards the deceased, in which he took the trouble to explain that the death of lawyer Vernet had been the result of a horrible accident. He claimed that he had been meeting with Vernet for business matters, that Vernet had shown him a revolver, and that the gun had accidentally discharged. He signed the letter as Henry Bogan. The police began an investigation. To begin with, the police already knew it was a murder. A reward was established for information on the whereabouts of Henry Bogan, who didn't actually exist as such, and they circulated the letter, which had the handwriting, not of Bogan, but of Leon Pleasant-Tells, the murderer. And as there is always someone who notices something, especially in those days when people were few, and as the saying goes, we are few and we know each other. A chemist who had corresponded with Leon and recognized his handwriting. Let's say, what bad luck for Leon. Not only did someone with whom he corresponded recognize his handwriting, but also that this person had such a good memory, or, in any case, Leon's handwriting was so distinctive as to be remembered. Anyway, life is full of synchronicities, as Carl Gustav Jung would say. Once the police were on Leon's trail, they found him soon after, interrogated him, and he confessed everything. The two brothers, Armand, the enamored ideologist, and Leon, who sought to settle his debts with his brother and prove his worth in the process, were arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment after a short trial. 2 years later, Armand died after sharing a glass of warm wine with his brother in prison. This last detail doesn't imply anything more than that. Here, we don't intend to establish a moral. In any case, we leave it to the imagination and suspicion of each of you. While in prison, Leon Pleasant-Tells learned 6 languages. After 30 years in jail, he was granted parole and released at the age of 65. He possibly spoke like a polyglot, but by that point, what good would it do him? He changed his name, but this time for different reasons. He no longer thought of killing, but rather of killing himself, and ended up committing suicide by jumping off a cliff. So, as expected, this story ended very badly. Let's move on to the second story. This is a very curious murderer, and everything surrounding this case is quite bizarre and peculiar. His name was Pierre Curie. The events took place in the mid-18th century. Pierre Curie killed his victims by feeding them. Yes, as you heard, he fed them until they collapsed. He did this without any poison, but with a competitive purpose. He would challenge people who ate a lot to see if they could eat more than him. And since he seemed to have an endless stomach, the competitor usually ended up dead. But not in one night or two. These competitions lasted for months. He would invite people to his house and make them eat continuously for 2 months, a year. In this way, he killed 9 people. Here arises a question that perhaps you are also asking yourselves at this moment. What kind of individuals would be willing to participate in such a competition, and what would their motivations be? Hunger? Competition? Loneliness? In short, what did Pierre Curie use to attract these people to his residence, and even to spend long periods with him? Actually, we don't have the answers to these questions. But not all questions need to have answers. The important thing is to exercise the question. Don't you think? It was said that Curie had a stomach similar to that of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King of France. That is, a huge stomach. And there was no way to beat it, and he knew it. It seems he began to boast about those feats. It is never wise to boast of having triumphed in competitions where the loser ends up dead, and even less wise for the one who commits the crime. What do you think? And it wasn't actually the law that ended Pierre Curie's murderous spree, but rather a competitor more capable than him, someone who surpassed him in his until then peculiar and aberrant skill. A man named Hamelin, who was the second assistant to the public executioner of the time. And it seems that there was no way to satisfy this man. Pierre Curie loved choosing a competitor who was an executioner and being able to include him in the list of his victims. This posed a greater challenge for him. Serial killers often have aberrantly overcoming motivations, at least from their perspective. It seemed to be the epitome of paradox. But at the beginning of the competition, Curie became worried because he realized that Hamelin had an unprecedented capacity to ingest food. Hamelin ate everything. Nothing affected him. And so they were for a year and then another year. For 2 years, these two men ate in a way that any normal human could not withstand. And Pierre Curie realized that there was no way to make his opponent collapse. Now, dear friends, I ask you, and forgive me for so many questions, but this story that came to me is a bit poorly told. Why can't I imagine 2 people who, for 2 years, every day, dedicate themselves to competing and eating without having any other dynamic of bonding? What did they talk about? What did they do? Did they play cards? Did they listen to music? What did they do during those 2 years? Anyway, let's continue with the story that still interests me. Haemline looked healthier than ever, and he hadn't gained a pound. Desperate, our murderer promised himself that he would succeed in killing Haemline with his method of choking him with food, even if it meant risking his entire fortune. But there was another detail. Haemline knew Giri's plans and was prepared to trap him. In reality, he was cheating. Now I understand something. This Haemline, besides being an executioner, living with someone for 2 years whom we don't know what they did besides eating. At least we know he wasn't stupid. He took advantage of that time to realize that Peer Giri wanted to kill him, and even feeding him. How curious this whole story is, don't you think? It seems that when Giri wasn't looking, Haemline took the opportunity to purge himself. He took laxatives, lemonades, and went from the bathroom to the living room, and the truth is that Giri didn't suspect anything. He believed himself to be so clever that he didn't realize the obvious. It often happens with those who feel they are superior to others. One night, they sat down to eat marinated pork loin. Giri tried in vain to catch up with his guest who was faster than him. Suddenly, Giri, after serving himself the 14th portion, began to turn red and then white, and Haemline, cutting the 15th piece, thought Giri was going to sneeze. The host tried to speak but couldn't. He smiled and fell face down onto his plate. In other words, he had died. That's how his murders ended. He was not punished by the law, but by a man who worked for the law, like the assistant executioner Haemline. The truth is, what comes to mind about this peculiar story would be something like, he who lives by the sword, dies by the sword. Let's move on to the third and final story. Don't leave because this one promises more. Countess Marie Magdalene Dory, born in 1630, was the daughter of a French state councillor, Count Antony Dory. According to the chronicles, Marie was distinguished by her beauty and had the habit of displaying her graceful bust wherever she went. In 1651, at the age of 21, she married Jean Gobelin-Villy. Her recent husband descended from a well-known family of tapestry makers, Gobelins, that adorned the palaces of the nobles of the time. The rule among the nobles circulating in the environment of Louis XIV, the King of France at that time, was gallantry, and Jean Gobelin-Villy loved pleasures and parties. At one of these costume parties, Jean introduced his wife Marie to a gentleman named Vincent Croix, and the party wasn't even over when Marie and Vincent Croix had already become lovers. That wasn't wasting time. Later, Marie Magdalene expressed to her close circle those preferences she liked about Vincent Croix. For good taste, we won't enumerate them. It even seems that she mentioned it to her father, Antony Dory, who, as we said, was an advisor to the King of France. We assume, why not assume, that the dialogue with her father might have been,
"Father, I am married to my husband, who is wealthy, and his family is of nobility, and they make wonderful tapestries and all that, but the truth is, I am attracted to Vincent Croix. What do you want me to say, father?"
The reaction of the father of Countess Marie Magdalene, Don Antony Dory, was anger, not tolerating that his daughter was an adulteress. He even decided to order the confinement of his daughter's lover, Vincent Croix, in the Bastille, a prison where convicts went at that time. It was when Vincent, imprisoned in the Bastille, met an Italian chemist named Della Matta, known as the virtuoso of arsenic because he was an expert in poisons. Vincent Croix, during his time in prison, learned from Della Matta the art of preparing poisons. When he left the Bastille, he had knowledge to poison a tiger on the run. And the first thing he did after leaving prison was to go see Marie Magdalene and teach her how to handle some poisonous components. Marie liked that of learning to handle poison, and she even began to train in administering poisons. To do this, she decided to visit hospitals, bringing food to the sick, to which she had previously mixed poisons prepared by her, to see if these had the macabre effect she expected from her new knowledge. Some time passes, and Marie Magdalene decides to start poisoning her father, Antony Dory. Over time, he begins to feel unwell until his daughter Marie achieves her goal, to kill her father. Up to that moment, Marie Magdalene evaluates as a conclusion that it took her 8 months to kill her father, according to the doses of poisons she took care of administering in his meals. During that time, she also took care to alternate daughterly affection with doses of poison. The court physician certified at that time the natural cause of death of Anthony Dory. This would be like the ultimate triumph of a poisoner, because poisoning anyone could do it, but in terms of the consequences of this despicable act, from the perspective of the perpetrator, it is that it is not discovered. Marie Magdalene, from that moment on, feels immune and begins to have many lovers and to commit many crimes. And at this point, we can deduce the macabre pleasure that Marie Magdalene experienced from committing these acts. That is, when she didn't like someone for some reason, she simply took care to poison them. She had several children, both from her relationship with her husband Jean and with her lover Vincent Croax. She also had a child with another, who was a first cousin of hers named Biencourt, and another child even with Delamata, the one who had been the primordial teacher that her lover Vincent had taught to prepare poisons. To get the lion's share of her father's inheritance, whom she had killed, she also poisoned her brother. After all, it didn't cost her anything. Afterward, Marie Magdalene also poisoned some women who served her in her house, with whom she had imprudently shared some compromising confidences about herself. And that's when suspicion arises among those who knew Marie Magdalene. I would add, more than suspicion. Sometimes there are facts that cannot be proven. But if something has 4 legs, fur, and says woof, it is very likely not an elephant. Faced with such strange deaths, her first cousin Biencourt is one of those who lived in fear, and suspecting what his cousin, lover, and mother of one of his children Marie Magdalene was doing, he decides to administer himself antidotes of all kinds at all times. Poor Biencourt, living with that imminent danger. As for her official husband Jean, the millionaire of tapestries, he treated her gallantly, but nevertheless she begins to poison him as well. And even though the good man tried to have everything served by a trusted assistant because he also suspected his wife, this did not prevent Marie from fulfilling her objective. In reality, she wanted to kill her husband to marry her lover. It's been so many that we can get a little lost in the list. Vincent Croax. But Vincent was then very comfortable as a bachelor, and knowing what Marie Magdalene was doing with her husband Jean, Vincent supplied antidotes to Marie's husband so he wouldn't die, just to avoid getting married. What a paradox. She had become a murderer, in addition to having the essential condition to be one, by risking everything for someone who didn't consider her as important as she imagined. In this case, better for Vincent Croax. This whole situation was as macabre as it was extraordinary. Everything ends when Vincent Croax dies, the original lover of Marie Magdalene, with whom she wants to marry, and he doesn't want to. On one occasion, while he was conducting some chemical experiments, one of the containers he was handling broke, causing his death. What an irony of life, isn't it? When Marie Magdalene Dory learns of this, she flees France, because Vincent Croax had many letters from her that compromised her. There she talked about the numerous crimes she had committed for love. I imagine her writing to her beloved Vincent, today I poisoned one more, etc. After a period of a long odyssey through the Netherlands, she is arrested while begging in a park. She is transported to Paris and imprisoned, and in June of 1676 she was decapitated. Dear friends, I am Edgar Allan Poe. My work was infamous for its macabre nature, and my life was filled with sorrows. But compared to the lives of these characters, I believe I feel marveled by the life I have lived. The paths of evil are plagued with dark deeds, often as absurd as they are detestable. I promise to bring you other topics to analyze from a criminological perspective, but today I leave you with a reflection, as simple as it is valid. Let us set aside extreme acts such as crime or murder. Throughout all epochs of humanity, these impoverish the human condition. Just as deception does, along with shortcuts of convenience, the lack of fundamental principles and values that, beyond the difficulties we all must endure to varying degrees in life, we must elevate our vision to make life something worth living, not only by refraining from criminal acts, but by striving to look beyond our own wall, the one that often prevents us from seeing how wonderful it is to live. We await you in a new story of historical impact, Private Lives. Subscribe. It doesn't cost much, It's just a finger movement on the screen. I thank you for your kindness and generosity. I tell you, Edgar Allan Poe.